The champagne flute felt foreign in my hand as I watched my sister accept another congratulations across the crowded hotel ballroom. Crystal's engagement party was everything she'd dreamed of since we were kids, all ivory linens and cascading flowers, the kind of celebration that costs more than most people make in 6 months. I stood near the back wall, nursing my sparkling cider and trying to blend into the wallpaper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody had introduced me to anyone tonight, not that I expected them to. My mother glided past in her navy blue dress, the one she'd bought specifically for this occasion, pausing to whisper something to my aunt that made them both glance in my direction before quickly looking away. The same look they'd been giving me for 20 years. The look that said I didn't quite belong, but they couldn't figure out how to make me disappear completely. Crystal stood center stage in her designer gown, radiant and perfect, just like she'd always been. Her fiancé Marcus held court beside her, regaling a cluster of relatives with stories about his latest real estate ventures. Every few minutes, someone would raise their glass and toast their future, their success, their bright tomorrow. I took another sip of my cider and checked my watch. 8:30. I could probably slip out in another hour without anyone noticing. That's when the television mounted above the hotel bar caught my eye. The volume was muted, but the scrolling news banner at the bottom made my stomach drop. Breaking: local tech entrepreneur wins International Innovation Award. My face filled the screen. Not the version of me standing awkwardly by the wall in a borrowed black dress. The other me. The one in the tailored blazer accepting a crystal trophy at the World Technology Summit in Geneva. The one with confidence radiating from every gesture as I shook hands with the Swiss Minister of Economic Affairs. The room continued buzzing with conversation and laughter, oblivious to the silent television that had just turned my world upside down. My hands began to tremble as I watched footage of my acceptance speech, my lips moving soundlessly on screen as subtitles scrolled beneath. Revolutionary AI platform helps reunite over 50,000 missing persons with their families. I set my glass down on a nearby table before I could drop it. The news segment continued, showing clips of my company's headquarters in Seattle, interviews with families who'd found their missing loved ones through our technology, statistics about our success rate that made my chest swell with pride, even as my throat constricted with panic. Then the camera panned to show me cutting a ribbon at our newest facility, and I heard my name spoken aloud for the first time all evening. Isn't that... My cousin Derek's wife squinted at the screen, her voice carrying across the suddenly quieter room. More heads turned, conversations faltered. The elegant background music seemed to grow louder as human voices dropped to whispers. My mother followed the collective gaze to the television, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. Her face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. She looked from the screen to me and back again, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Crystal's laugh died mid-note. Marcus stopped talking, his mouth hanging open slightly. The circle of admirers around him began to dissolve as everyone's attention shifted to the silent drama playing out on the muted news broadcast. The reporter was interviewing Detective Sarah Morrison from the Seattle Police Department now, praising our missing persons database for solving cold cases that had been dormant for decades. The screen showed a map dotted with red pins, each one representing a successful reunion facilitated by our platform. "That's definitely her," Derek said, his voice loud in the sudden quiet. "That's Zara." All eyes turned to me. 53 faces staring with varying degrees of shock, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on my shoulders like a physical thing. I hadn't moved from my spot by the wall, but somehow I felt exposed, naked, as if they could see right through the carefully constructed facade I'd maintained for the past 2 decades. Crystal's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. "But that's impossible. She gestured vaguely in my direction, searching for words that wouldn't come. My father finished quietly from across the room, his words carrying despite his low tone. The silence that followed was deafening. I was 13 when they left me at the Riverside Travel Plaza, mile marker 247 on Interstate 84. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no tearful goodbye, no promise to come back. My stepfather Gary just pulled into a parking space between a semi-truck and a rusted Camaro, turned off the engine, and said, "Get out." I sat in the back seat clutching my backpack, confused. Why? Are we getting gas? My mother didn't turn around. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, her shoulders rigid. "Just get out, Sarah." "But where am I supposed to go?" Gary twisted in the driver's seat to look at me, his pale eyes flat and emotionless. "You'll figure it out. You're smart enough, right? Always telling us how smart you are." I climbed out slowly, still believing this was some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that would be cleared up in a moment. The July heat hit me like a wall, the asphalt soft under my sneakers. The car door slammed shut behind me with a finality that made my chest tight. Through the back window, I could see Crystal in her car seat, barely 2 years old, sleeping peacefully. She looked angelic with her blonde curls and pink dress, everything I had never been allowed to be. My mother finally turned to look at me, and for just a second, I thought I saw regret flicker across her face. But then Gary put the car in reverse, and whatever maternal instinct might have surfaced got buried under 23 years of choosing him over me. I stood there watching our blue Honda Accord disappear into traffic, taking with it everything I had ever known. My home, my family, my entire world, gone in the space of a few minutes on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The gas station was busy with travelers coming and going, none of them paying attention to a skinny 13-year-old girl standing alone in the parking lot. I walked inside, the air conditioning a relief against my flushed skin, and approached the counter where a bored-looking teenager was reading a magazine. "Excuse me," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Can I use your phone to call someone?" He looked up, taking in my appearance with disinterest. "Phone's out of order." It wasn't. I could see it hanging on the wall behind him, the receiver dangling from its cord. But I was 13 and scared, and I didn't know how to argue with authority figures yet. I bought a candy bar with the $3 in my pocket and sat on the curb outside, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Cars continued pulling in and out around me, people filling their tanks and buying snacks and getting back on the road to wherever they belonged. I didn't belong anywhere. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized they weren't coming back. This wasn't a test or a scare tactic or a poorly planned family intervention. This was abandonment in its purest form. A trucker named Bill found me there at midnight, still sitting on the same curb with my backpack beside me like a faithful dog. He was a grandfather with kind eyes and a gentle voice who bought me a sandwich and listened to my story without judgment. "You can't stay here, little girl," he said, settling his considerable weight onto the curb beside me. "It's not safe." "I don't have anywhere else to go." He was quiet for a long time, watching the traffic flow past us in both directions. Finally, he sighed and pulled out his cell phone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'm going to call someone who can help you, someone who knows what to do in situations like this. The someone turned out to be Mrs. Patterson, a social worker who arrived an hour later in a dented Toyota Camry. She was middle-aged with graying hair and tired eyes, but her smile was genuine when she crouched down to my level. "Hi, Zara. I'm going to take you somewhere safe tonight, okay?" The somewhere safe was Riverside Children's Home, a converted Victorian mansion that housed 23 other kids who, like me, had been discarded by the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. The walls were painted cheerful colors that didn't quite mask the underlying sadness that permeated every room. My first night there, I lay awake on a narrow twin bed, listening to muffled crying from the room next door, and tried to understand what I had done wrong. What flaw in my character had been so severe that my own mother chose to abandon me on the side of a highway rather than continue raising me? I was smart, just like Gary had said with such disdain, I'd been reading since I was 4, doing algebra in my head by the time I was 10, writing computer programs on our old desktop when other kids my age were still playing with dolls. But apparently, being smart wasn't enough to make me worth keeping. The other kids at Riverside had stories too. Tommy's parents died in a car crash, leaving him with a drug-addicted uncle who couldn't be bothered. Maria's mother had schizophrenia and had been institutionalized after trying to burn down their apartment. Jason aged out of foster care at 18 and ended up back on the streets within a month. But none of them had been deliberately abandoned by people who were supposed to love them. None of them carried the specific weight of knowing they had been consciously rejected, weighed, and found wanting by their own family. Mrs. Patterson tried to explain it to me during our weekly sessions in her cluttered office. Sometimes adults make terrible decisions when they're overwhelmed, Zara. It doesn't mean you're not worthy of love. But I was 13 and heartbroken, and her words felt like empty platitudes. If I was worthy of love, why was I alone? The answer, I decided, was that I needed to become worthy. I needed to transform myself into someone so successful, so undeniably valuable, that no one would ever choose to discard me again. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that worried the staff at Riverside. While other kids played video games or watched television, I devoured textbooks and programming manuals. I taught myself advanced mathematics, multiple programming languages, and everything I could find about artificial intelligence and data analysis. At 14, I tested out of high school. At 16, I had my associate's degree. At 18, I graduated magna cum laude from Oregon State University with a double major in computer science and psychology, paying my way with scholarships and part-time jobs that left me exhausted but determined. The day I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, the auditorium was filled with proud families cheering for their graduates. I sat in the front row with the other honor students, scanning the crowd for a familiar face I knew wouldn't be there. Mrs. Patterson had come, bless her heart, along with 2 of my former housemates from Riverside who had become like siblings to me over the years. They cheered loudly when my name was called, but their voices couldn't fill the empty space where my mother should have been. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, I walked alone to my beat-up Honda Civic and drove back to my tiny studio apartment. I had achieved something remarkable, something that should have made any parent proud. But there was no one to share it with, except the mirror. That night, I made myself a promise. I would build something so extraordinary, create something so valuable, that my absence from their lives would become impossible to ignore. I would make them see what they had thrown away. I just didn't know it would take 20 years. My first startup failed spectacularly. I was 19, fresh out of college, and convinced that my revolutionary social media platform would change the world. I'd scraped together $15,000 from my savings and a small business loan, working 18-hour days in my apartment trying to build something that would matter. The platform was designed to help people find lost connections, using advanced algorithms to match users based on shared experiences and geographic data. Looking back, I can see it was a crude prototype of what would eventually become my life's work, but at the time, it felt like everything. 6 months later, I was bankrupt and humbled. Turns out 19-year-olds with brilliant ideas and no business experience make predictable mistakes. I'd burned through my funding without acquiring enough users to sustain the platform, and bigger companies with deeper pockets were already moving into the social media space. I moved back to Riverside temporarily, sleeping in the same room I'd occupied as a teenager while I figured out my next move. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was trying to help other people find their lost connections while being completely disconnected myself. Failure isn't the end of your story, Mrs. Patterson reminded me during one of our conversations in her office. It's just information. What did you learn? I learned that passion without strategy leads to burnout. I learned that brilliant technology means nothing without understanding human psychology. I learned that building something meaningful requires patience and persistence, not just intelligence. Most importantly, I learned that I was more resilient than I'd given myself credit for. My second startup went better. I was 22 by then, working as a software developer for a mid-sized tech company in Portland while developing my new platform on nights and weekends. This time, I focused on a specific problem, helping adopted children find their birth families. The inspiration came from my friend Lisa, another Riverside alumna who had spent years searching for her biological parents. She'd hired private investigators, submitted DNA samples to multiple databases, and spent thousands of dollars with no success. Traditional methods were expensive, slow, and often ineffective. I realized I could use data analysis and pattern recognition to streamline the process. By cross-referencing public records, social media data, and genetic markers, my algorithm could identify potential family connections with unprecedented accuracy. It took me 3 years to build and refine the system, working in my spare time while maintaining my day job. I tested it first with Lisa's case, and within 2 weeks, we had identified her birth mother living in Sacramento. The reunion was emotional and complicated, like most family reunifications. There were tears, awkward conversations, and a lot of catching up to do. But Lisa finally had answers to questions that had haunted her entire life. Word spread quickly through adoption circles and social workers. More people began reaching out, asking for help finding their biological families, lost siblings, parents who had given children up for adoption decades earlier. I quit my day job and incorporated as Reconnect Solutions, operating out of a shared workspace in downtown Portland. My first year in business, we successfully reunited 47 families. My second year, we helped over 200 people find their lost connections. But success brought new challenges. As our case volume grew, so did the complexity of what people were asking us to find. Missing persons cases started trickling in from law enforcement agencies. Parents searching for children who had run away or been abducted. Adult children looking for parents who had disappeared when they were young. Each case felt personal to me in a way I couldn't fully explain to my small team of developers and researchers. Every missing person represented someone's abandoned child, someone's lost family member, someone's unresolved grief. I began partnering with police departments across the Pacific Northwest, offering our services for cold cases that had exhausted traditional investigative methods. Our success rate was remarkable, partly because of our advanced technology, but mostly because I understood something about being lost that the professionals had never experienced firsthand. When you've been abandoned, you develop an intuition about how people disappear. You understand the psychology of running away, of starting over, of trying to become someone new. You know where to look because you've been there yourself. By the time I turned 28, Reconnect Solutions had offices in 3 cities and a team of 37 employees. We were processing over 1,000 cases annually with success rates that were attracting international attention. I was invited to speak at conferences, consulted with law enforcement agencies across the country, and featured in magazine articles about innovative technology companies. My personal story remained carefully hidden beneath layers of professional accomplishment. Nobody in my business world knew that the CEO of Reconnect Solutions had once been a 13-year-old abandoned at a gas station. Nobody knew that my passionate dedication to reuniting families came from my own desperate hunger for connection. I had built the life I dreamed of during those dark nights at Riverside Children's Home, but it still felt hollow in the places where family should have been. Success is a poor substitute for love, though it took me years to admit that to myself. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown Seattle office. My assistant knocked on my door with an apologetic expression. "There's someone on line 3 who says she's your sister. She sounds upset." I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "My sister?" "Crystal Morrison. She says it's urgent." My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone. I hadn't heard from anyone in my family for 15 years, not since I'd tried calling my mother on my college graduation day and been told never to contact them again. "Hello? Zara?" The voice was older than I remembered, but unmistakably Crystal's. "Is this really you?" "Yes, it's me. She faltered, and I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. "I need your help. I know we haven't talked in forever, and I know what happened was horrible, but I don't know where else to turn." My chest felt tight. "What's wrong?" "It's Emma, my daughter. She's been missing for 3 days, and the police aren't doing enough. They say she probably ran away, but I know something terrible has happened to her. She wouldn't just leave like that. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of someone else's desperation settling onto my shoulders. How old is she? 16. Please, Zara. I know you do this kind of work now. I've been following your company online. I know you help people find missing family members. The irony was overwhelming. The sister who had been in the car when I was abandoned, who had grown up in the family I'd been excluded from, was now asking me to find her missing child. Send me everything you have, I heard myself saying. Photos, recent communications, anywhere she might have gone. I'll start working on it immediately. Thank you, Crystal whispered. Thank you so much. After I hung up, I sat alone in my office staring out at the Seattle skyline, trying to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to help, because that's what I did. But underneath the professional response was a 13-year-old girl who wanted to scream, "Where were you when I needed help? Where were you when I was the one who was missing?" Instead, I called my team together and briefed them on the new case. Emma Morrison, 16 years old, last seen leaving her high school in Bend, Oregon, 3 days ago. No history of running away, good grades, close relationship with her mother. Within 6 hours, we had traced her digital footprint to a coffee shop near the Greyhound station, where security footage showed her talking to an older man in a baseball cap. From there, the trail went cold, but we had enough information to start building a profile. I worked 18-hour days for the next week, following leads and analyzing data with an intensity that worried my staff. This wasn't just another case to me. This was my niece, a girl I'd never met who carried half my DNA and might be in terrible danger. We found her in a motel room in Spokane, drugged and terrified, but alive. The man who had taken her was part of a trafficking ring that preyed on vulnerable teenagers at bus stations and shopping malls. Emma had been lured with promises of modeling opportunities and independence from her controlling mother. The rescue was coordinated with local law enforcement and FBI agents who had been tracking the same trafficking network for months. Emma was hospitalized for observation and reunited with Crystal, who flew to Spokane immediately. I didn't go with her. I stayed in Seattle, processing the paperwork and debriefing with the agents, maintaining my professional distance from what had become a deeply personal case. Crystal called me from the hospital that evening, crying so hard she could barely speak. "She's safe. She's okay. Zara, you saved my daughter's life." "I'm glad we could help," I said, falling back on the formal language I used with all our clients. "I want to see you. I want Emma to meet you. I want—" She paused, searching for words. "I want to try to make this right somehow." "There's nothing to make right," I lied. "I'm just glad Emma is safe." But Crystal was persistent in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of our mother. Over the following months, she continued calling, sending photos of Emma, updating me on their family's progress in therapy and recovery. She told me about her life, her marriage to Marcus, her career as a pediatric nurse. She talked about our mother's battle with depression, our father's heart attack 2 years earlier, Gary's death from cancer. She painted a picture of a family that had struggled and grown and learned from their mistakes. She never directly apologized for what had happened to me, but I could hear the weight of guilt in her voice every time we spoke. She was trying to rebuild a bridge that had been burned 20 years ago, and I wasn't sure I was ready to meet her halfway. The invitation to her engagement party arrived on embossed cardstock, addressed to Dr. Zara Chen, CEO of Reconnect Solutions. She had done her research, learned about my professional accomplishments, and decided I was finally worth including in family celebrations. I almost didn't go. The rational part of my brain knew it would be emotionally complicated and potentially destructive. But there was still a part of me that needed to see them again, to understand who they had become in my absence. I told myself I was going for closure, to finally put the past to rest. I didn't admit, even to myself, that I was going because I still desperately wanted to belong somewhere, even if that somewhere had never truly wanted me. The hotel ballroom was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant, expensive, filled with people who looked like they'd never questioned their place in the world. I wore a simple black dress I'd bought the day before. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. I planned to stay for an hour, maybe two, long enough to show that I was fine, successful, completely unaffected by their past rejection. Then I would leave quietly and never look back. I hadn't planned on the television broadcast that would change everything. As I stood there with 53 pairs of eyes staring at me in shocked silence, I realized that my carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The professional success I'd built as armor against their rejection suddenly felt inadequate in the face of their collective disbelief. My father's words hung in the air like a physical presence. She's nobody. But the television screen behind him told a different story. It showed a woman who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had helped thousands of families find each other, who had turned her own abandonment into a force for healing in the world. I wasn't nobody.
I never had been. I just needed them to see me for who I had become, not who I had been when they threw me away. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, my mother set down her champagne flute and took a tentative step toward me. "Zara," she said, her voice uncertain, "is that really you on the television?" I met her eyes for the first time in 20 years, seeing the woman who had given birth to me but had never been my mother in any meaningful way. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered, but her eyes still held that same uncomfortable combination of love and rejection that had haunted my childhood. "Yes," I said simply, "it's me." The admission seemed to break whatever spell had held the room in suspended animation. Conversations resumed in urgent whispers, heads turning between me and the television screen as if trying to reconcile the two versions of reality. Crystal moved through the crowd toward me, her engagement gown rustling against the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "I can't believe you're here," she whispered when she reached me. "I can't believe you came." "You invited me." "I know, but I didn't think. I mean, after everything." She gestured vaguely, encompassing 20 years of silence in a single helpless motion. Marcus appeared at her side, his real estate success suddenly seeming insignificant compared to what he'd just learned about his fiancé's abandoned sister. He extended his hand tentatively. "Marcus Williams, I've heard so much about you." I almost laughed at the lie, but I shook his hand instead. "Nice to meet you." "The television said you've helped reunite over 50,000 families," he continued, clearly trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just discovered. "That's incredible work." "It keeps me busy." Around us, the party continued its awkward dance of celebration mixed with shock. Relatives who had dismissed me an hour earlier were now whispering about my success, trying to reconcile their memories of the unwanted 13-year-old with the accomplished woman they saw on screen. My Uncle Frank, who had always treated me like an inconvenience, pushed through the crowd with his phone in his hand. "I just looked up your company online. Says here you're worth $23 million. "Frank," my mother hissed, but he ignored her. "23 million," he repeated, staring at me with newfound respect that felt more insulting than his previous indifference. "And you're single? No kids?" "No," I said quietly. "No family at all." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread through the assembled crowd. Because that was the truth they couldn't face. They had abandoned a child who had grown up to be exactly the kind of person any family would be proud to claim. But they had forfeited that right 20 years ago at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. "Zara, we need to talk. There's so much you don't understand about what happened back then." "I understand enough," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You made a choice. You chose Gary over me, and then you chose Crystal over both of us. I've made peace with that." "But we didn't know," she said desperately. "We didn't know you would become this." She gestured toward the television, where footage of my latest award ceremony was still playing. "Would it have mattered if you did?" The question hung between us, unanswered and unanswerable, because the truth was that they had abandoned a brilliant 13-year-old who was already showing signs of exceptional intelligence and determination. They hadn't thrown away a nobody. They had discarded someone who had always been somebody, even when she was too young to prove it to the world. I looked around the room one last time, taking in the faces of people who had written me off decades ago and were now struggling to rewrite their understanding of who I was and what I had become. "Congratulations on your engagement, Crystal," I said finally. "I hope you'll be very happy together." I turned toward the exit, but my mother's voice stopped me. "Please don't leave. Not again. We've lost too much time already." I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorframe. "You didn't lose time, Mom. You chose to waste it." And then I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the family who had never deserved me, and finally, completely, understanding that I had never needed them. The real story was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up in my downtown Seattle penthouse to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The story of my appearance at Crystal's engagement party had somehow leaked to the media, though I suspected my Uncle Frank's big mouth had something to do with it. The headlines were predictably sensational. Tech CEO confronts family who abandoned her as child. From gas station to boardroom, one woman's incredible journey. Missing persons expert was once missing herself. I sat on my balcony overlooking Elliott Bay, drinking coffee and scrolling through news articles that attempted to piece together a story they didn't fully understand. They had the basic facts, but none of the emotional complexity, none of the nuanced pain that came with being unwanted by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. My assistant called at 8:30. The phones are ringing nonstop. Interview requests from Good Morning America, The Today Show, 60 Minutes, plus about a dozen book publishers and 3 different documentary filmmakers. "Tell them all no," I said automatically. "Even Oprah?" That gave me pause. Oprah called? Her people did. They want to do a special about family reconciliation and healing. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of other people's expectations settling onto my shoulders. Everyone wanted a neat redemption story, a tearful reunion, a Disney-worthy ending where forgiveness conquered all. But life wasn't a movie, and some wounds didn't heal just because cameras were rolling. "Still no," I said finally. "Okay. Also, Crystal Morrison called. She wants to meet with you privately, without the rest of the family."
Should I put her through if she calls back? I considered it. Part of me was curious about what Crystal had to say now that the shock had worn off, now that she'd had time to process what she'd learned about my life. If she calls again, I'll take it. She called an hour later, her voice subdued and careful. "Can we meet somewhere, just the two of us? I know you probably don't want to see any of us again, but I need to explain some things about what happened when we were kids." We met at a small cafe in Capitol Hill, neutral territory where neither of us had memories or expectations. Crystal arrived first, looking younger than her 22 years in jeans and a sweater, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light. I recognized her immediately, despite the 20 years that had passed. She still had our mother's green eyes and delicate bone structure, still carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. We ordered coffee in awkward silence, both of us struggling with the weight of a conversation that was 20 years overdue. "I remember that day," Crystal said finally, "at the gas station. I was only 2, but I remember bits and pieces. I remember you crying." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I asked about you for months afterward. Where was Zara? When was Zara coming home? Mom and Gary kept telling me you had gone to live with other people who could take better care of you." "And you believed that?" "I was 2, Zara, then 3, then 4. By the time I was old enough to really understand what had happened, you were just a distant memory, a sister I'd had briefly who had gone away." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. A little girl with dark hair and serious eyes, maybe 5 years old, sitting on a swing set. "I found this in Mom's closet when I was in high school. She kept pictures of you, even after you were gone." I asked her about it and she broke down crying. That's when she told me the truth about what really happened. I stared at the photo, remembering the day it was taken. We'd been at a park near our old house in Portland, back when Gary was still trying to play the role of devoted stepfather. She said Gary gave her an ultimatum, Crystal continued. Choose him or choose you. He said he couldn't handle raising another man's kid, especially one who was so, she hesitated. So what? So difficult, so intense. You were always asking questions, always challenging everything, always making him feel stupid. He said it was you or him. I laughed bitterly, and she chose him? She was 26 years old with a 2-year-old daughter and no job skills. Gary was the first man who had ever offered to take care of us both. She thought she was making the practical choice. She thought abandoning her 13-year-old daughter at a gas station was practical? Crystal's eyes filled with tears. She regretted it immediately. She said she cried for 3 days straight, but Gary convinced her it was too late to go back, that you would be better off in foster care than in a home where you weren't wanted. I wasn't unwanted. Gary didn't want me. There's a difference. I know that now. We all know that now. But at the time? At the time, she chose her boyfriend over her daughter. Let's not dress it up in noble intentions, Crystal. She made a choice, and I lived with the consequences. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the weight of a story that had shaped both our lives in different ways. She never got over it, Crystal said finally. The guilt ate at her for years. She and Gary divorced when I was 7 because she couldn't forgive him for making her choose. She spent the rest of my childhood battling depression and anxiety. And you spent your childhood being the daughter she kept instead of the one she threw away. That must have been complicated. Crystal nodded, tears streaming down her face. I felt guilty about everything. Every privilege I had, every moment of love and attention, every opportunity. I kept thinking about you out there somewhere, wondering if you were okay, if you had enough to eat, if anyone was taking care of you. Despite myself, I felt a pang of sympathy for the little girl who had grown up in my shadow, carrying guilt that should never have been hers to bear. When Emma went missing, she continued, and I called you for help, it was like a sign from the universe, like maybe I could finally do something to make up for what happened to you. You don't owe me anything, Crystal. You were a child. None of this was your fault. Maybe not, but I was still the beneficiary of their choice. I got the childhood that should have been yours. I studied her face, seeing not the privileged princess I'd imagined all these years, but a young woman who had been carrying her own burden of survivor's guilt. What do you want from me? I asked. I want to know you. I want to know who you really are, not just the successful CEO version. I want to understand what those 20 years were like for you. I want my daughter to know her aunt, if you'll let her. The request hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. I had spent 2 decades building walls around the abandoned 13-year-old who still lived somewhere inside me, and Crystal was asking me to tear them down. I don't know if I'm capable of that, I said honestly. I've been on my own for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be someone's family. We could figure it out together. I looked at her, this woman who shared my DNA but felt like a stranger, and tried to imagine what a relationship between us might look like. Could I learn to trust someone who had benefited from my exile? Could she learn to see me as more than a source of guilt and redemption? Tell me about Emma, I said finally. Tell me about your daughter. Crystal's face lit up with the unmistakable glow of maternal pride. She's incredible, Zara, smart like you were, but more confident. She wants to be a forensic anthropologist, help solve cold cases, and bring closure to families. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sounds familiar. She's been asking about you constantly since she got home from the hospital. She wants to thank you personally for saving her life. I was just doing my job. No, it was more than that. The FBI agent told me you worked around the clock for a week, that you refused to give up even when the trail went cold. That wasn't just professional dedication. She was right, though I wasn't ready to admit it. Emma's case had consumed me in a way that went beyond professional obligation. Maybe because she was my niece, or maybe because I saw myself in her situation, a young girl who had disappeared from the world of people who loved her. I'd like to meet her, I heard myself saying, if she wants to meet me. Crystal smiled through her tears. She wants to meet you more than anything. We arranged to have lunch the following weekend at Emma's favorite restaurant, a quirky little place in Bend that specialized in comfort food and vintage arcade games. I drove down from Seattle on Saturday morning, my stomach churning with anxiety about meeting the niece I'd never known existed. Emma was waiting in a corner booth when I arrived, and I recognized her immediately, despite having only seen her in missing person photos and hospital surveillance footage. She had Crystal's delicate features, but my dark hair and serious eyes. She was reading a forensic science textbook while she waited, completely absorbed in whatever she was studying. "Emma?" I said, approaching the table tentatively. She looked up and smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Aunt Zara, I can't believe you're really here." The word aunt hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't expected it to carry such emotional weight, hadn't anticipated how it would feel to be claimed by someone who saw me as family without reservation or qualification. "It's good to meet you," I said, sliding into the booth across from her. "How are you feeling after everything that happened?" "Better. Therapy helps, and Mom's been really supportive. But I wanted to thank you personally for finding me. The FBI agent said most cases like mine don't end well." I studied her face, looking for signs of trauma or lasting damage from her ordeal. She seemed remarkably resilient for someone who had been through such a terrifying experience. "I'm just glad you're safe." "Can I ask you something?" Emma said, leaning forward with the intensity I recognized from my own teenage years. "What made you start your company? Like, what made you decide to dedicate your life to finding missing people?" The question was innocent enough, but it cut straight to the heart of everything I'd spent 20 years trying to avoid talking about. I could deflect, give her the sanitized version I used in interviews, or I could tell her the truth. "I was missing once too," I said quietly, "in a different way than you were, but missing all the same." "What do you mean?" I looked around the restaurant, at the families sharing meals and the teenagers playing vintage video games, and tried to find the words to explain what it felt like to be erased from your own family. When I was your age, I felt invisible, like I didn't matter to the people who were supposed to love me. So I guess I started my company to help other people feel found. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Like, you couldn't save yourself when you were young, so you save other people now." Her perceptiveness was startling. At 16, she had identified something it had taken me decades to understand about my own motivations. Something like that. We talked for 2 hours, covering everything from forensic science to family dynamics to her plans for college. Emma was brilliant and curious and completely unafraid to ask difficult questions. She wanted to know about my education, my business, my personal life, treating me like a real person rather than a cautionary tale or a source of family drama. When it was time to leave, she hugged me goodbye, and I felt something shift inside my chest. For the first time in 20 years, someone was treating me like family without conditions or qualifications. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "If you want to." "I definitely want to. Maybe you could come to my graduation next month. I'm valedictorian." The pride in her voice was infectious. I'd be honored to be there. Driving back to Seattle that evening, I found myself thinking about the future in a way I hadn't in years. Not just my professional goals or business expansion plans, but the possibility of having people in my life who cared about me as more than a service provider or success story. The following month, I sat in a crowded high school auditorium watching Emma deliver a valedictorian speech about perseverance and second chances. Crystal was beside me, crying proud tears, and for a moment, I could almost imagine what it might have been like to grow up as part of this family. After the ceremony, Emma introduced me to her friends as my Aunt Zara, the one who saved my life. The teenagers gathered around me with the same curiosity Emma had shown, asking questions about my work and my technology. But it was an older woman who approached me as the crowd was dispersing, who delivered the conversation that would change everything. "Excuse me, are you Zara Chen from Reconnect Solutions?" I turned to see a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, holding a graduation program in her trembling hands. "Yes, I am." "My name is Patricia Walsh. I've been trying to reach your company for months, but I keep getting told my case doesn't fit your usual criteria." My assistant had mentioned several calls from women whose cases fell outside our normal parameters, situations that were too old or too complex for our standard procedures. What kind of case? Patricia looked around nervously, then leaned closer. My daughter disappeared 32 years ago. She was 6 years old. The police say she's probably dead, but I never believed that. I think she's out there somewhere, living under a different name, maybe not even knowing she was taken. I felt the familiar tug of someone else's desperation, the weight of a mother's unresolved grief settling onto my shoulders. 32 years is a long time. Most of our technology is designed for more recent disappearances. I know it's a long shot, but I've seen what you've accomplished with other impossible cases. Please, I'll pay whatever it costs.
I just need to know what happened to my little girl. Something in her voice reminded me of my own mother's desperation when Crystal had called about Emma. The primal fear of a parent who had lost a child and never stopped looking. "Send me everything you have," I heard myself saying. "I can't promise anything, but I'll take a look." Patricia's case file arrived by overnight courier the next Monday, a thick manila envelope containing 3 decades of false leads, dead ends, and fading hope. Sarah Walsh had vanished from a playground in Tacoma while her mother was talking to another parent just 20 feet away. One minute she was on the swings, the next she was gone. The initial investigation had focused on stranger abduction, but no body was ever found, no ransom demands made, no solid leads developed. Over the years, Patricia had hired private investigators, consulted psychics, and followed up on hundreds of tips that led nowhere. I spread the contents across my conference table and studied them with fresh eyes, looking for patterns the original investigators might have missed. Missing person cases from the 1990s were notoriously difficult to solve because they predated most of our modern digital tracking tools, but they also had fewer false leads to sort through. The police reports were thorough, but limited by the technology available at the time. No cell phone records to analyze, no social media presence to investigate, no digital footprints to follow. Just witness statements, physical evidence, and traditional detective work. But there was something in the timeline that caught my attention. Sarah had disappeared on a Tuesday afternoon in March during spring break when many families were traveling. The playground had been unusually crowded with out-of-town visitors and tourists. I pulled up our database of solved abduction cases from the same time period and began looking for patterns. What I found was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Several children had gone missing from public places during school holidays in the Pacific Northwest during the early 1990s, all between the ages of 5 and 8, all taken during brief moments when their parents' attention was diverted. None of the cases had been connected at the time because they occurred in different jurisdictions, and the internet hadn't yet made it easy for law enforcement agencies to share information across state lines. I spent the next week building a comprehensive database of missing children from that era, using every resource at my disposal to identify potential connections. The pattern that emerged was chilling. At least 17 children had vanished under similar circumstances between 1989 and 1994, all from locations within a 300-mile radius of Seattle. The implications were staggering. If these cases were connected, it suggested a sophisticated child trafficking operation that had been operating for years without detection. More importantly, it meant that some of these children might still be alive, living under assumed identities with no knowledge of their true origins. I called Patricia and asked her to come to my office for a briefing. When she arrived, her hands were shaking with anticipation and fear. "I think your daughter's case is connected to a larger pattern," I said, showing her the map I'd created with red pins marking each disappearance. There were at least 16 other children who vanished under similar circumstances during the same time period. Patricia stared at the map, her face pale. "You think someone was taking children systematically?" "I think it's possible. The question is, what happened to them afterward? Some might have been trafficked internationally, but others might have been placed with families who didn't ask too many questions about where they came from." "You mean adopted illegally?" "It's one possibility. There was a thriving black market for healthy infants and young children in the early 1990s, especially children who could pass for their adoptive parents' biological offspring." Patricia was crying now, overwhelmed by the possibility that her daughter might still be alive after 3 decades of believing she was probably dead. "What do we do now?"
We start with the most recent technology and work backward. DNA databases have exploded in the past decade, and there's a chance Sarah, or someone related to her, has submitted a sample for genealogy research. I had Patricia provide a saliva sample for genetic testing, then uploaded her profile to every major DNA database available to law enforcement. The results came back within a week. No direct matches, but several distant genetic connections that could potentially lead us to Sarah if she was still alive. The closest match was a woman named Jennifer Morrison living in Vancouver, British Columbia. She shared enough genetic markers with Patricia to be a second or third cousin, which meant she might have information about other family members who had moved to the Pacific Northwest in recent decades. I called Jennifer personally, explaining that I was investigating a missing person case and needed to trace family connections. Walsh, Jennifer said, thinking it over. I don't know any Walshes personally, but my grandmother might have known some. She kept detailed family records going back several generations. Jennifer's grandmother, it turned out, had been the unofficial family historian for their branch of the Morrison clan. Her records included not just births, deaths, and marriages, but also adoptions, name changes, and family relocations dating back to the 1800s. There's something here that might interest you, Jennifer said during our second conversation. My grandmother has a note from 1991 about a distant cousin who adopted a little girl under unusual circumstances. She was suspicious about it at the time because the adoption happened very quickly and the paperwork seemed incomplete. My pulse quickened. Do you have names? Robert and Margaret Thorne. They lived in a small town called Cedar Falls, about 2 hours north of Seattle. The little girl was named Sophie, but Grandma's note suggests that might not have been her original name. Cedar Falls was a logging community with a population of less than 3,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but also respected privacy when it mattered. If someone wanted to quietly adopt a child without too many questions, it would be an ideal location. I drove up to Cedar Falls on a Friday morning, ostensibly to investigate a different case, but actually to do reconnaissance on the Thorne family. The town was exactly what I'd expected. A single main street lined with local businesses, surrounded by modest homes and endless forests. The Cedar Falls Public Library doubled as the town's historical society and informal information center. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, was happy to chat with a visiting researcher from Seattle. The Thornes, she said when I mentioned the name casually. Oh yes, lovely family. Moved away, must be 15 years ago now. Their daughter went off to college and they retired to somewhere warmer. Daughter? Sophie. Sweet girl, very bright. Always had her nose in a book, just like her father. She got a full scholarship to the University of Washington, studied journalism if I recall correctly. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice casual. Any idea what happened to her after college? I heard she got married and moved to Portland, works for one of the newspapers down there, I think. Her adoptive parents were so proud of her. Dorothy's casual mention of adoption confirmed what I'd suspected. Sophie Thorne had been adopted as a child, and the timing aligned perfectly with Sarah Walsh's disappearance. Back in Seattle, I spent the weekend tracking down every Sophie Thorne who had attended the University of Washington in the early 2000s. There were 3 possibilities, but only one had studied journalism and moved to Portland after graduation. Sophie Thorne was now Sophie Martinez, a 38-year-old investigative reporter for The Oregonian. She had covered dozens of high-profile stories over the past decade, specializing in cases involving missing persons and unsolved crimes. The irony was breathtaking. If my theory was correct, a woman who had been abducted as a child was now dedicating her career to helping other victims find justice. I spent hours researching Sophie's background, looking for any information that might confirm or disprove my suspicions. She had a strong digital presence thanks to her journalism career, with bylined articles dating back more than a decade. Her writing was sharp and compassionate, particularly when covering cases involving missing children. She had a knack for finding new angles on cold cases and had helped several families get renewed attention for their missing loved ones. In one article from 3 years earlier, she had written about the lasting impact of childhood trauma on adult development. The piece was professional and well-researched, but there were subtle hints that she was writing from personal experience. Children who experience early trauma often struggle with identity and belonging throughout their lives, she had written. The question of who they might have been if their childhood had unfolded differently can become a driving force in their adult choices. I found myself wondering if Sophie had any conscious memories of her life before the adoption, or if she had always accepted the story her adoptive parents told her about her origins. The only way to know for sure was to approach her directly, but that presented significant ethical and legal challenges. If Sophie really was Sarah Walsh, she had built an entire life based on her assumed identity.
Learning the truth about her origins could be devastating, especially if her adoptive parents had been loving and supportive. On the other hand, Patricia Walsh had spent 32 years wondering what happened to her daughter. She deserved to know the truth, even if it was complicated. I decided to reach out to Sophie professionally, using my company's reputation as a way to start a conversation. I sent her an email explaining that I was investigating a series of connected missing person cases from the early 1990s and would value her perspective as someone who specialized in similar stories. Sophie responded within hours, expressing interest in the cases and offering to meet when she was next in Seattle for work. We met at a coffee shop in Pike Place Market the following Thursday. Sophie was petite with dark blonde hair and green eyes, bearing only a superficial resemblance to the age-progressed photos Patricia had commissioned over the years. But there were smaller details that made my pulse race. A small scar on her left temple that matched one mentioned in Sarah Walsh's medical records. A distinctive birthmark on her hand that Patricia had described in detail. "These missing children cases are fascinating," Sophie said, reviewing the files I'd prepared for our meeting. "The pattern you've identified is really compelling. Have you considered the possibility that some of these children might still be alive?" "It's one of the theories we're exploring," I said carefully. "What made you interested in this kind of reporting?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "I've always been drawn to stories about identity and belonging. There's something about missing person cases that feels personal to me, though I'm not entirely sure why." "Personal how?" "I was adopted as a child. My parents were wonderful, but I've always had this sense that there was something missing from my understanding of who I am. Like there was a story that started before my conscious memory begins." My throat felt tight. "Have you ever tried to research your biological family?" "A few times, but the adoption was private and the records are sealed. My parents told me my birth mother was very young and unable to care for me, that the adoption was the best thing for everyone involved." She paused, studying my face with the sharp attention of an experienced investigative reporter. "Why do I get the feeling there's more to this meeting than you've told me?" I had reached the moment of truth, the point where I had to decide whether to reveal my suspicions or continue gathering evidence in secret. Looking at Sophie's intelligent, curious face, I realized I couldn't continue the deception. "I think you might be one of the missing children I'm investigating," I said quietly. The words hung between us like a live wire. Sophie set down her coffee cup with hands that had begun to shake slightly. "What are you talking about?" "I think you're Sarah Walsh. I think you were taken from a playground in Tacoma when you were 6 years old and placed with the Thorne family through an illegal adoption network." Sophie stared at me for a long time, her reporter's instincts warring with personal shock. "That's impossible. I've been Sophie Thorne my entire life. I have memories going back to when I was very small." "What's your earliest memory?" She was quiet, thinking. "I remember being in the hospital when I was maybe 6 or 7. I had pneumonia, and my parents were so worried. My mom slept in the chair next to my bed every night." "Nothing before that?" "Fragments. Playing in a backyard somewhere, a woman with red hair singing to me. But those could be dreams or things I've imagined." I pulled out a photo Patricia had given me, a picture of 6-year-old Sarah Walsh taken just weeks before she disappeared. Sophie looked at it for a long time, her breathing shallow. "She looks like me," she whispered. "I know this is overwhelming, but I think your biological mother is still alive. Her name is Patricia Walsh, and she's been looking for you for 32 years. Sophie pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. "I need some air. This is too much." We walked outside into the bustling market, the noise and chaos providing a strange counterpoint to the life-changing conversation we were having. "Even if what you're saying is true," Sophie said finally, "what am I supposed to do with that information? The Thornes are my parents. They raised me, they loved me, they supported every dream I ever had." "I'm not suggesting you abandon the family that raised you, but Patricia Walsh has never stopped looking for you. She deserves to know you're alive and well."
And what about me? What do I deserve? It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with since I first suspected Sophie's true identity. You deserve the truth about where you came from. You deserve the choice about whether to connect with your biological family. And maybe most importantly, you deserve to know that you were loved and wanted from the very beginning. Sophie was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what she just learned. The woman with red hair. Patricia has red hair? She did when you were young. It's silver now, but yes. Oh my God. Oh my God. Those weren't dreams, were they? Those were real memories. I reached out and touched her arm gently. I think so, yes. We spent the next hour walking through Pike Place Market while Sophie asked questions and tried to make sense of 32 years of false identity. She was remarkably composed for someone whose entire understanding of her origins had just been shattered. I want to meet her, she said finally. Patricia, I want to meet my birth mother. Are you sure? There's no pressure to do this quickly. You could take time to process everything first. No, I've been processing this my whole life without knowing it. All those stories I've written about missing children, all that research into family reunification, I think I've been unconsciously searching for my own story. I called Patricia that evening and explained what I'd discovered. She was speechless for several minutes, overwhelmed by the news that her daughter was not only alive, but had grown up to become exactly the kind of person any mother would be proud to claim. She's a journalist, Patricia whispered. She helps other families find missing loved ones? She's built an entire career around it. When can I see her? We arranged to meet at my office the following Saturday, neutral territory, where both women could feel safe and supported. I spent the week preparing for what I knew would be an emotionally intense reunion, consulting with trauma counselors and family therapists about the best way to facilitate the meeting.
Saturday morning arrived gray and rainy, typical Seattle weather that seemed appropriate for such a momentous occasion. Patricia arrived first, clutching a photo album filled with pictures of Sarah as a baby and young child, along with letters she'd written to her missing daughter over the years. Sophie arrived precisely on time, looking nervous but determined. She had brought her adoptive parents, Robert and Margaret Thorne, who had driven up from their retirement home in Arizona after learning the truth about their daughter's origins. The Thornes were in their 70s now, a gentle couple who had clearly adored Sophie from the moment she entered their lives. Robert was a retired high school English teacher, Margaret a former librarian, both of them the kind of people who would have made excellent parents under any circumstances. "We always wondered," Margaret said to me quietly while Sophie and Patricia prepared to meet. "There were so many inconsistencies in the adoption paperwork, so many questions that never got answered. But Sophie needed a home, and we needed her. Did you know she had been abducted?" We suspected something wasn't right, but we told ourselves it was better not to look too closely. She was so traumatized when she came to us, so afraid and confused. We just focused on helping her heal. The meeting between Sophie and Patricia was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more heartbreaking than I'd anticipated. Patricia sobbed when she saw her daughter for the first time in 32 years, and Sophie cried as she recognized features of her own face in her birth mother's. They talked for hours, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of 3 decades apart. Patricia showed Sophie baby pictures and told her about the little girl she remembered, curious, fearless, always asking why about everything. Sophie shared her own memories, the fragments that had always seemed disconnected but now made perfect sense. The red-haired woman singing lullabies, a house with a big front porch, a dog named Chester who had died when she was very young. "I named my first dog Chester," Sophie said, laughing through her tears. "I never knew why that name felt so important to me." The Thornes handled the revelation with remarkable grace, understanding that Sophie's reunion with her biological mother didn't diminish their role in her life. If anything, it validated the choice they'd made to love and raise a traumatized child as their own. "We always knew this day might come," Robert said. "We're just grateful we had 32 years to be her parents." By the end of the day, Sophie had 2 complete families and a fuller understanding of her own identity. She also had dozens of new questions about the adoption network that had facilitated her placement with the Thornes. "I want to help you investigate the other cases," she told me as everyone was preparing to leave.
If there are 16 other families out there who never got answers, we need to find them. That conversation launched the most intensive investigation of my career. Over the following months, Sophie and I worked together to trace the illegal adoption network that had operated in the Pacific Northwest during the early 1990s. What we discovered was a sophisticated criminal organization that had kidnapped dozens of children and placed them with families who were willing to pay premium prices for healthy, white infants and toddlers. The operation had been run by a lawyer named Mitchell Crenshaw, who had connections with corrupt social workers, private investigators, and even some law enforcement officials. Crenshaw had died in 2003, taking most of his secrets with him, but financial records and testimony from some of his former associates helped us piece together the scope of his operation. We identified 7 other children from my original list who had likely been placed through Crenshaw's network. 4 of them were still alive and living under their adopted identities. 3 had died in accidents or from illness over the years, never knowing their true origins. Each reunion was different. Some were joyful, like Sophie's meeting with Patricia. Others were complicated by families who had built their lives around secrets they weren't ready to reveal. But every case brought closure to parents who had spent decades wondering what happened to their children. Every success validated the choice I'd made 20 years earlier to dedicate my life to helping people find their missing connections. The investigation also brought Sophie and I closer together in ways I hadn't expected. Working side by side on such emotionally intense cases created a bond that went beyond professional collaboration. "You know what's funny?" Sophie said one evening as we reviewed case files in my office. "All those years I spent feeling like something was missing from my identity, and it turns out I was unconsciously trying to reunite other people with their missing pieces. That's not funny, that's poetic justice." Maybe, or maybe it's just proof that we're all drawn to heal the wounds we carry, even when we don't consciously understand what those wounds are. I thought about my own journey, how my abandonment had led me to build a career around preventing other people from feeling lost and unwanted. "Do you think we would have found each other eventually?" I asked, "even if Patricia hadn't hired me to investigate Sarah's disappearance?" "I think so. There are too many connections, too many coincidences. You helping my cousin Emma find her way home, me specializing in missing person cases, both of us drawn to stories about family and belonging. The universe has a way of bringing people together when they need each other." Sophie had become more than a colleague in the months since we'd started working together. She was the friend I'd never allowed myself to have, the sister I'd never thought I deserved. Through her, I was learning what it meant to be part of a chosen family, a network of people who cared about each other, not because of shared DNA or legal obligations, but because of shared values and mutual support. Emma had started visiting Seattle regularly, spending weekends at my apartment and talking about her plans to study forensic science in college. She wanted to intern at Reconnect Solutions during her summer breaks, following in the footsteps of both her aunt and the woman who had become like a second aunt to her. Crystal and I were still navigating the complicated process of rebuilding a relationship that had been severed for 20 years. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding. But we were both committed to moving forward rather than staying trapped in the pain of the past. My mother remained a more complicated relationship. She had reached out several times since Crystal's engagement party, asking to meet and talk about what had happened when I was 13. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, but I was beginning to think that someday I might be. The success of the Crenshaw investigation had brought national attention to Reconnect Solutions, along with funding opportunities that would allow us to expand our services and help even more families. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when my assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." Patricia Walsh stood in my doorway holding a small wrapped package, her face glowing with the happiness that came from having her daughter back in her life. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, sitting down across from my desk. "Not just for finding Sophie, but for understanding what it meant to both of us. It was my privilege to help bring your family back together. I know this is your job, but it felt like more than that. It felt like you understood something about being lost that most people don't." I accepted the package she offered, unwrapping it to reveal a silver bracelet engraved her the simple message: "No one is too far away to be found." "Sophie helped me choose it," Patricia said. "She said you would understand what it meant." I did understand. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like I had been found too. The bracelet caught the light as I fastened it around my wrist, a tangible reminder that the work I did mattered, not just to the families I helped, but to the abandoned 13-year-old who still lived inside me. She had been worth saving after all. As Patricia left my office, I turned back to the window overlooking Elliott Bay and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From a gas station in the middle of nowhere to a corner office in downtown Seattle. From being nobody's daughter to being everyone's advocate. The family who had abandoned me thought they were discarding someone worthless. Instead, they had created someone who understood the value of every missing person, every lost connection, every family searching for wholeness. I had spent 20 years proving them wrong, but more importantly, I had spent 20 years proving to myself that I had always been worth finding. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. Another case, another family in crisis, another opportunity to help someone find their way home. I answered on the second ring, ready to begin again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years after Sophie and I had closed the last case from the Crenshaw investigation. It was hand-delivered by a courier who waited while I signed for it, the thick cream envelope bearing only my name in elegant script. Inside was an invitation that made my hands tremble as I read it.
You are cordially invited to the wedding of Emma Claire Morrison and David Alexander Hayes. October 28th, 2 p.m., Riverside Gardens, Bend, Oregon. Below the formal text, Emma had added a handwritten note. Aunt Zara, I can't imagine this day without you there. You're the reason I believe in second chances and happy endings. Please say you'll come walk me down the aisle alongside Mom. I want both my mothers there with me. I set the invitation down on my desk and stared out the window at the Seattle skyline, processing the weight of what Emma had asked me to do. In the years since we'd reconnected, she had gradually begun referring to me as one of her mothers, a designation that still caught me off guard every time I heard it. I had watched her graduate valedictorian from high school, cheered her through 4 years at the University of Washington, where she studied forensic anthropology, just as she had promised, and celebrated when she landed her dream job with the King County Medical Examiner's Office. Now she was marrying a pediatric nurse she'd met during her internship, a kind young man who treated her with the gentleness she deserved after everything she'd survived. The wedding was going to be small, just family and close friends gathering in the same gardens where Crystal and Marcus had been married 5 years earlier. That wedding had been the beginning of our family's slow journey toward healing, and Emma's would mark another milestone in our ongoing reconstruction. I called Emma that afternoon to accept the invitation and found myself crying when she squealed with delight at the news. "I was so nervous you'd say no," she admitted. "I know it might feel weird, sharing that moment with Mom when you two are still figuring things out." It was true that Crystal and I remained a work in progress. We spoke regularly now and had developed a genuine affection for each other, but there were still moments when the weight of our shared history created tension between us. "Nothing could keep me from being there," I told Emma truthfully. "I'm honored that you want me to be part of such an important day." "Good, because I also have another favor to ask. David's parents can't make it from Chicago because his dad is having surgery that week. I was wondering if maybe Sophie could officiate the ceremony. She got ordained online specifically so she could marry us." Sophie had become an integral part of our extended family in the years since we'd found each other through the investigation. She and Patricia had developed a close mother-daughter relationship that complemented rather than competed with her bond with the Thorns. She was also one of the few people who understood the unique dynamics of our reconstructed family. "I think that's a beautiful idea," I said. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with planning and preparation that reminded me how foreign the rhythms of family life still felt to me. There were dress fittings and menu tastings, shower arrangements and bachelor party coordination, all the intricate choreography of bringing people together for celebration. I threw myself into the preparations with the same intensity I brought to my work, determined to give Emma the perfect wedding she deserved. But underneath the logistics and excitement was a deeper emotional preparation I was having to navigate.
Walking Emma down the aisle meant stepping into a role I had never expected to play, claiming a place in her life that went beyond being the aunt who had saved her from trafficking. It meant accepting that I belonged in this family, not because of obligation or guilt, but because of love. The night before the wedding, I found myself sitting in my hotel room in Bend, staring at the dress I would wear tomorrow. It was a soft blue silk that Emma had helped me choose. Sophisticated, but not attention-grabbing, appropriate for someone who was important enough to share the honored walk, but not the bride herself. A knock at my door interrupted my pre-wedding anxiety. I opened it to find my mother standing in the hallway, looking nervous and uncertain. "Hello, Zara. I hope it's not too late for a visit." We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since a tense phone conversation about Emma's college graduation that had ended with both of us hanging up in frustration. But here she was, the night before her granddaughter's wedding, finally ready for the conversation we'd been avoiding for decades. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, though she was only in her early 60s. The years of carrying guilt about what she'd done to me had taken their toll, aging her in ways that went beyond simple time. "I know this isn't the ideal moment for this conversation," she began, sitting carefully in the chair by the window. "But tomorrow, watching you walk Emma down the aisle, I know I'm going to be thinking about all the moments I missed with you, all the occasions when I should have been the one standing beside you." I sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining distance, but not rejecting her presence entirely. "What do you want me to say, Mom? That it's okay? That 25 years of absence can be erased with one conversation?" "No, I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. I chose a man over my own child, and I've regretted that choice every single day since. But not enough to try to find me. Not enough to reach out when I was 18 or 21 or when I graduated from college." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face with an honesty I'd never seen from her before. "I was ashamed. I was terrified that you would reject me the way I had rejected you. I told myself you were better off without me, that I had already done enough damage." "I wasn't better off without you. I was lost and alone and convinced that I was inherently unlovable because the person who gave birth to me couldn't stand to keep me." The words came out more harshly than I had intended, but they were true, and they needed to be said. "You were never unlovable, Zara. You were brilliant and challenging and intense, and I was too young and too selfish to appreciate what a gift that was." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the weight of a conversation that was 30 years overdue. "I don't know how to be your mother now," she said finally. "I don't know if I have the right to try." "I don't know either," I admitted. "But maybe we could figure out how to be something. Maybe we could start over and see what develops." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door cracked open. A possibility for something new to grow in the space where our relationship should have been. She stood to leave, pausing at the door with her hand on the handle. "I'm proud of who you became, Zara. I'm proud of the work you do and the lives you've saved. I know I don't have the right to take any credit for that, but I want you to know that I see what you've accomplished." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet hotel room thinking about the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. Tomorrow, I would walk my niece down the aisle, flanked by the sister who had grown up with the childhood that should have been mine. The mother who had abandoned me would be sitting in the front row, finally ready to claim her place in my story. The found family I'd built through my work would be scattered throughout the congregation, chosen relatives who had become more important to me than blood. It wasn't the family I'd dreamed of as a child, but it was the family I'd created through persistence and purpose and the radical act of refusing to disappear. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect October weather that made Oregon feel like paradise. I spent an hour getting ready, paying more attention to my appearance than I had in years. When I arrived at the gardens, Emma was already there in her dressing room, radiant in the vintage lace gown she had found at an estate sale. She looked young and happy and completely confident in the choice she was making. Aunt Zara, you look beautiful. Are you ready for this? Are you? I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Crystal appeared in the doorway, elegant in a navy dress that complemented my blue silk. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two women who had shared a complicated history but were united in their love for this remarkable young woman. Thank you for being here, Crystal said to me quietly, for being part of this. Thank you for letting me be part of it. The ceremony was intimate and perfect, with Sophie officiating with the same grace she brought to everything else in her life. When the music began and it was time for Emma to make her entrance, she positioned herself between Crystal and me, linking her arms through ours. "My two mothers," she said with a smile that could have powered the entire city. "Let's go get me married." Walking down that aisle, flanked by Emma's joy and Crystal's presence, I felt something shift inside me that had been frozen for decades. For the first time since I was 13 years old, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The ceremony itself was beautiful but brief, focused on the love between Emma and David rather than elaborate ritual. When Sophie pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause and tears. At the reception afterward, I found myself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, not because of what I could do for them or how I could solve their problems, but simply because I was part of their chosen family. Patricia was there with her husband, a gentleman she'd married 5 years after finding Sophie. The Thorns had made the trip from Arizona, proud as any grandparents watching their daughter's child begin a new chapter. Even some of my colleagues from Reconnect Solutions had driven down for the celebration. But it was during the father-daughter dance, when Emma pulled me onto the floor to join her and Crystal in a three-way embrace, that I finally understood what I'd been searching for my entire adult life. I hadn't been looking for revenge against the family who abandoned me. I hadn't been trying to prove that I was worthy of love. I had been trying to create something new, a different kind of family, built on choice and commitment rather than accident of birth. As we swayed to the music, Emma whispered in my ear, "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for finding all of us." "Thank you for letting me be found," I whispered back. The party continued late into the evening, with toasts and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from celebrating love in all its complicated forms. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone on the garden terrace, looking up at the stars. Sophie joined me, still wearing her officiant stole and carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, handing me a glass. "Just thinking about how strange life is. 25 years ago, I was convinced I would spend my entire life alone. Now look at this." I gestured toward the reception, where Emma and David were saying goodbye to the last of their guests, while Crystal and Marcus cleaned up decorations. "You know what I think?" Sophie said. "I think some people are born into their families, and other people have to create them. But the families we create are just as real and just as important as the ones we're born into. Maybe more important, because we choose them consciously." "Exactly, and they choose us back, which is the most important part." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the celebration wind down around us. Tomorrow, Emma would begin her married life, Crystal would return to her nursing practice, and I would go back to Seattle to continue the work that had become my calling. But something fundamental had changed in the space of a single day. I was no longer the abandoned child who had built a successful life to prove she was worthy of love. I was a woman who had found her place in a constellation of relationships that might not look traditional from the outside, but was perfect for the people who lived within it. 6 months after the wedding, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I announced that I was stepping back from the day-to-day operations of Reconnect Solutions to focus on writing a book about family reconstruction and the psychology of belonging. The book, which I titled Found, A Journey from Abandonment to Purpose, became a bestseller and led to speaking engagements around the country. But more importantly, it opened conversations about the different ways families can be formed and reformed throughout our lives. I also used my platform to advocate for better support systems for children aging out of foster care and adults searching for their biological families. The success of the Crenshaw investigation had shown me how many people were living with questions about their origins, and I wanted to make sure they had resources to find answers safely and ethically. Emma and David moved to Seattle after their honeymoon, and I had the joy of watching their relationship deepen as they built their life together. Emma joined my company as a forensic consultant, bringing her anthropological training to cases involving unidentified remains. Crystal and I continued our slow dance of rebuilding trust and affection. It would never be the sisterly relationship we might have had if we'd grown up together, but it was something real and valuable in its own right. My mother and I began having monthly phone calls, tentative conversations that gradually deepened as we learned how to relate to each other as adults. She would never be the mother I'd needed when I was 13, but she was becoming someone I could tolerate and occasionally even enjoy talking to. But the most unexpected development came 2 years after Emma's wedding, when I received a call from a woman named Dr. Jennifer Wu, who ran a residential program for teenagers aging out of foster care. "I've been following your work and your story," she said. "I have a proposition that might interest you." Her proposition was to establish a mentorship program that would pair successful adults who had been through the foster care system with teenagers who were about to age out. The idea was to provide practical guidance and emotional support during one of the most vulnerable transitions in a young person's life. Too many of these kids end up homeless or in crisis because they don't have anyone to teach them basic life skills or believe in their potential, Dr. Wu explained. "You've built an incredible life from similar circumstances. Your story could inspire them to see possibilities they might not otherwise imagine." The program, which we called Second Chances, launched 6 months later with a cohort of 12 teenagers and 6 mentors. I was paired with a 17-year-old named Marcus, who reminded me intensely of myself at that age. Brilliant, angry, convinced that the world had written him off before he had a chance to prove himself. Marcus had been in foster care since he was 9, bouncing between homes that saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be nurtured. He was planning to drop out of high school and work construction because he didn't think college was realistic for someone like him. "Someone like you went to college at 16, I reminded him during one of our early meetings. "Someone like you built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. Someone like you just wrote a best-selling book." "Yeah, but you're different. You're special." "I'm not different from you in any way that matters. I just had people along the way who convinced me I was worth investing in." Working with Marcus and the other teens in the program gave my life a new dimension of purpose. These young people were facing the same fears and challenges I had navigated alone, but they didn't have to do it alone. Over the course of 2 years, I watched Marcus transform from a defensive, angry teenager into a confident young man with plans to study computer science at the University of Washington. He was accepted with a full scholarship and moved into the dorms just 3 blocks from my downtown condo. "I want to start a company like yours someday," he told me over dinner during his freshman orientation week. "But instead of finding missing people, I want to find missing opportunities for kids who grew up like we did." "That sounds like exactly the kind of company the world needs," I said. As I watched him walk back to his dorm that night, young and eager and full of plans for the future, I realized that my story had come full circle. The abandoned child had become the adult who refused to let other children feel abandoned. The gas station where my family left me had become the launching point for a life dedicated to making sure no one else had to navigate the world completely alone. I still kept the newspaper clipping from Emma's wedding announcement in my wallet, not because I needed the validation anymore, but because it reminded me of the moment when I finally understood that family isn't about the people who give birth to you. Family is about the people who choose to love you, support you, and celebrate your victories, even when they have nothing to gain from your success. 5 years after Emma's wedding, I received an invitation that brought tears to my eyes. It was from Marcus, who had graduated summa cum laude and was getting married to a social worker he'd met during his senior year. "Zara," he wrote in a note accompanying the invitation, "you saved my life by showing me that my beginning didn't have to determine my ending. Would you do me the honor of walking me down the aisle? You're the closest thing to a parent I've ever had, and I can't imagine this day without you there. Standing in my closet, choosing what to wear to another wedding where I would play the role of chosen family, I thought about the 13-year-old girl who had been left at a gas station with nothing but a backpack and a belief that she was unwanted. She could never have imagined that her abandonment would lead to this: a life filled with people who had chosen to love her, work that gave meaning to every difficult experience she'd survived, and the profound satisfaction of helping other people rewrite their stories. The family who threw me away thought they were discarding someone worthless. Instead, they had created someone who understood that every person has value, every story deserves to be heard, and every ending can be rewritten if you're willing to do the work. I had spent my entire adult life proving that I was worth keeping, but it wasn't until I learned to see myself through the eyes of the people who chose me that I finally understood the truth. I had always been worth keeping. I just needed to find the right family to see it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.